Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might make you appreciate your heated bedroom a little more. Picture this. You're a servant in a 14th century English castle, and as you settle down for the night, your breath literally freezes in the air above your face. Not outside, inside, in your sleeping quarters, where ice crystals form on the stone walls just inches from your head, and the only thing standing between you and hypothermia is a pile of straw that smells suspiciously like the stables and whatever body heat you can steal from the person shivering next to you. Most of us complain when the thermostat dips below 70 degrees, but medieval castle servants face nightly temperatures that would make a modern camping trip look like a luxury resort stay. You probably wouldn't last 3 nights without central heating insulation or even glass windows. The brutal truth is that many servants didn't survive their first winter, and those who did developed survival strategies that were equal parts ingenious and desperate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in complete darkness somewhere around what we'd call 3 in the morning. The first sensation isn't the cold, it's the sound. Stone walls conduct every noise through the castle like a medieval telephone system, amplifying the groans of settling timber, the scratch of rats in the walls, and the distant snores of 100 other souls trying to survive another night. Then comes the cold seeping through your thin woolen tunic like liquid ice, making every joint in your 16-year-old body feel ancient and brittle. Your sleeping chamber, if you can call an alcove carved into thick stone walls, a chamber measures roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. No heating system reaches this forgotten corner of the castle. The nearest fireplace belongs to your lord's solar 3 floors up, and a world away in terms of social hierarchy. Down here in the servants' quarters, warmth is a luxury reserved for the dying embers you might smuggle from the kitchen hearths wrapped in rags and clutched against your chest like a precious secret. Medieval castle builders prioritized defense over comfort with ruthless efficiency. Those magnificent stone walls that kept enemies at bay also created what modern engineers would recognize as a thermal mass system, absorbing cold during winter nights and radiating it back at anyone unfortunate enough to sleep against them. Historians still argue whether castle designers understood they were essentially building giant stone refrigerators, but the evidence speaks for itself in the mortality records of servant populations. You share this space with 3 other servants: Agnes, who works in the kitchens and whose hands are permanently stained with soot; Thomas, a stable boy whose clothes carry the permanent perfume of horses; and little Mary, barely 12, who tends to the Lord's hunting hounds and talks in her sleep about warm summer days that feel like distant fairy tales. None of you has privacy, personal space, or enough blankets to go around. Survival means cooperation, and cooperation means accepting that someone else's elbow will spend the night jabbed into your ribs, while you all huddle together like a litter of desperate puppies. The hierarchy of warmth in medieval castles followed the same brutal logic as everything else in feudal society. Your comfort depended entirely on your place in the pecking order. But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes being at the bottom actually worked in your favour, at least when it came to staying alive through the night. Picture the Lord's solar, that grand private chamber at the top of the keep. Massive stone walls, soaring ceilings, and huge windows designed to show off wealth and power. The nobleman lies beneath mountains of ermine and silk wrapped in furs that cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. Sounds luxurious, right? But here's the cruel irony. All that grandeur made the room impossible to heat. Those impressive high ceilings just meant more cold air to fill, and those thick stone walls absorbed heat like hungry sponges. Even with a roaring fireplace, the lord might find his breath forming frost clouds above his face. Meanwhile, down in the servants' quarters, you're crammed into spaces barely larger than modern closets. The ceilings are low, the walls closer together, and sometimes you're sleeping 3 or 4 to a room meant for 1. It's uncomfortable, cramped, and smells like a combination of wet wool and yesterday's dinner. But, and this is crucial, body heat has nowhere to escape. 4 shivering servants generate more warmth than one noble, no matter how many furs he owns. The castle's architecture enforced this hierarchy with ruthless precision. The higher your rank, the higher your chamber literally. Lords occupied the solar at the top of the tower, ladies had their bower chambers on upper floors, knights got middle-level rooms, and servants were relegated to ground-level spaces or underground storage areas converted into sleeping quarters. But here's what the builders didn't anticipate: heat rises and stone conducts cold. The higher you slept, the more exposed you were to wind and weather. Those prestigious upper chambers became wind tunnels in winter, while the lowly servants' quarters stayed slightly warmer, simply because they were buried deeper in the castle's belly. Social protocol made everything worse for the nobility. A lord couldn't share his bed with servants; that would be scandalous. A lady couldn't huddle with her maids under the same blankets; propriety forbade it. But servants had no such constraints. When Agnes, the kitchen maid, Thomas the stable boy, and little Mary, who tends the hounds, piled together under a single threadbare blanket, they're creating a survival strategy that the nobility's pride wouldn't allow them to adopt. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the thermal dynamics at play here. Some evidence suggests castle builders gradually learned to prioritize smaller, more easily heated chambers for winter use. Other records show nobles stubbornly clinging to their grand spaces, suffering through frozen nights, rather than admit that size wasn't always better. The pecking order extended to bedding materials too. Lords got goose down and imported silks, while servants made do with straw pallets and rough wool blankets that had been mended so many times they were more patched than original fabric. But straw, for all its humble origins, actually insulated better than you might expect. Those loose fibres trapped air pockets that held body heat, while silk and fine linens, beautiful as they were, offered little protection against genuine cold. What really determined your chances of surviving winter nights wasn't the quality of your bedding. It was your access to other people's body heat. The servants who slept packed together like sardines often fared better than the isolated noble freezing in splendid solitude. Status might determine your daytime comfort, but nighttime survival followed different rules entirely. Now let's talk about what you're actually sleeping on, because calling it a bed is being extremely generous. If you're a servant in a medieval castle, your sleeping surface is essentially a burlap sack stuffed with whatever organic matter the castle can spare. And I use the term organic matter deliberately, because it's not always straw. Your mattress, if we're dignifying it with that term, is called a palliasse or straw tick. Picture a rough canvas bag about the size of a modern single mattress, but half as thick, stuffed with whatever dried vegetation the servants could gather before winter set in. Ideally that's clean wheat straw or dried grass. In reality, it might be old rushes from the great hall hay that's seen better days, or even dried moss scraped from the castle walls. The lucky servants get mattresses stuffed with fresh straw that still smells like summer fields. The unlucky ones get whatever mouldy refuse is left over after the horses have been bedded down. The straw inside your tick isn't just sleeping material, it's a thriving ecosystem. Mice nest in it, attracted by grain fragments that inevitably get mixed in with the straw. They're actually not the worst roommates. Their body heat helps a tiny bit, and they generally mind their own business. The real problem is the insects. Fleas jump from the castle dogs to your bedding and set up permanent residence. Lice find the warm crevices perfect for breeding. And then there are the beetles, moths, and various crawling things that treat your mattress like a 5-star hotel. But here's what's fascinating: from a historical perspective, people didn't just accept these conditions passively. They developed sophisticated strategies for managing their bedding. Every few months, if they were lucky, servants would empty their straw ticks, completely beating out the old straw and refilling them with fresh material. The old straw didn't go to waste, it was burned in the castle hearths, providing a brief moment of extra warmth, and the satisfaction of knowing you were incinerating some of your unwelcome bedmates. Some castles implemented rotation systems, where servants shared better quality palliaces. Agnes might sleep on the good straw tick for a week, while Thomas makes do with the lumpy one, then they'd switch. It wasn't fairness, it was survival strategy. A servant who got too sick from poor bedding couldn't work, and useless servants didn't eat. The castle had a vested interest in keeping its workers functional, even if comfort wasn't part of the equation. Medieval people also discovered that certain herbs could improve their sleeping situation. Lavender, chamomile, and mint weren't just pleasant smelling, they repelled some insects and mice. If you could smuggle a handful of dried herbs into your straw tick, you might buy yourself a few weeks of slightly less infested sleep. Of course, good herbs were valuable, and servants caught hoarding them for personal use might find themselves sleeping on bare stone instead. The texture of sleeping on straw is something modern people struggle to imagine. It's not soft like a feather pillow, but it's not uniformly hard either. The straw compresses under your weight, creating a lumpy, uneven surface that shifts every time you move. Individual stalks poke through the canvas, jabbing at your ribs or back. The whole thing rustles with every breath like sleeping inside a giant bird's nest. And the smell, imagine dried grass mixed with dust mouse droppings and the accumulated odours of previous sleepers. It's earthy, musty, and unmistakably organic. Historians still debate how often servants actually change their straw bedding. Account books from some castles suggest fresh straw was provided seasonally, but other evidence points to servants using the same filling for years at a time. The truth probably varied wildly depending on the castle's wealth, the lord's generosity, and how harsh the winter was. In desperate times, even mouldy straw was better than sleeping directly on stone. Picture yourself settling down on your straw tick after a 14-hour day in the castle kitchens. Your back aches, your hands are raw from scrubbing, and all you want is to disappear into unconsciousness. But the straw crackles beneath you, announcing your every movement. Something small and fast scurries across your feet, mouse or beetle. You've stopped caring which. The straw has compressed into hard lumps under your shoulders, and you spend several minutes rearranging yourself, trying to find a position where the poking stalks don't dig too deeply into your flesh. Eventually exhaustion wins over discomfort, and you drift into the kind of sleep that medieval people knew best. Not restful, not comfortable, but deep enough to survive another night. Here's where medieval survival gets really intimate. When temperatures drop below life-threatening levels, your personal space disappears entirely. Modern people complain about sharing a king-size bed, but imagine deliberately packing yourself shoulder to shoulder with 3 other human beings on a straw mattress barely wider than a modern couch. Privacy wasn't just luxury, it was potentially fatal. The medieval concept of shared body heat followed what we might call the sardine principle. 4 servants crammed together could generate enough collective warmth to keep everyone alive, while 4 servants sleeping separately might not all see dawn. Your body becomes a heating element for the group, and everyone else's body becomes yours. You learn to coordinate breathing to shift positions without disturbing the human chain, and to accept that someone else's elbow will spend the night jabbed into your kidney. The logistics get fascinating when you consider the social negotiations involved. Who sleeps in the middle where it's warmest? Who gets relegated to the edges where drafts creep in? In most servant quarters, the hierarchy was based on practicality rather than rank. The smallest person, often young Mary, who tends the hounds, gets sandwiched between larger bodies because she needs the most protection. The biggest person, Thomas the stable boy with his broad shoulders, might claim an edge position because he can generate more heat for the group. Agnes, the kitchen maid, whose hands are permanently stained black from tending fires, has developed a reputation for being a hot sleeper. Her body runs warm from spending 14 hours a day next to roaring ovens, making her a valuable sleeping partner. Thomas, despite his size, tends to run cold because his work in the stables exposes him to constant drafts. The sleeping arrangements become a nightly negotiation based on thermal politics. Who's feeling feverish, who's been shivering all day, who managed to steal a cup of warm ale before bed. Animals play a crucial role in this human heating system. Castle dogs aren't just pets, they're living furnaces. A large mastiff curled against your feet can mean the difference between keeping your toes and waking up with frostbite. Cats weave themselves between sleeping bodies, purring engines of warmth that settle wherever heat is needed most. Some servants even befriend the castle's rats not for companionship, but because a few small warm bodies nestled in your clothing can provide precious extra degrees. The phrase 3-dog night might come from later folklore, but medieval people absolutely understood the principle. On the coldest nights, servants would gather every available warm-blooded creature. Dogs pile on top of the human cluster. Cats wedge themselves into any available space, and even the occasional chicken might find its way into the sleeping arrangement. The smell is overpowering: wet wool, unwashed human bodies, animal fur, and the lingering odours of whatever everyone ate for dinner. But warmth trumps comfort every single time. Historians still argue whether this communal sleeping was purely practical, or whether it served social functions as well. Some evidence suggests that sharing body heat created bonds among servants that crossed traditional hierarchies. When you depend on someone else's warmth for survival, social barriers break down. Kitchen maids sleep pressed against stable boys, scullery servants share blankets with ladies' maids, and everyone learns to ignore the usual rules about who can touch whom. But there are downsides that go beyond the obvious loss of privacy. Diseases spread like wildfire when people sleep packed together. Fleas and lice treat the communal bed like a highway system, jumping from person to person throughout the night. Someone's snoring keeps everyone awake, someone else's nightmares become everyone's problem, and bathroom needs require climbing over multiple sleeping bodies in pitch-black conditions. Picture yourself settling into this human pile for the night. The first few minutes are awkward elbows everywhere, someone's knee in your back, the constant shifting, as everyone tries to find positions that don't cause immediate pain. But gradually the warmth builds. 4 human bodies pressed together create a micro-environment that's several degrees warmer than the surrounding air. Your muscles stop shivering, your breathing slows, and despite the discomfort, you feel your body relaxing into the shared heat. The rhythm of communal sleep has its own music-synchronized breathing, the occasional murmur of someone talking in their sleep, the soft sounds of bodies shifting in unison. You learn to move without waking your sleeping partners, to breathe quietly, to accept that true rest means accepting the presence of others. Now we come to the lowest rung of the castle's sleeping hierarchy, the servants who couldn't even claim a proper bed. These were the scullery maids, stable boys, kitchen turnspits, and general labourers who literally slept on the floor of the great hall, competing with dogs for space near the dying embers of the massive central hearth. Picture the great hall after the evening feast has ended. The long trestle tables have been cleared away, stacked against the walls, and what was once a dining room transforms into a massive dormitory. Servants spread straw mats across the stone floor, arranging themselves in rough circles around the fireplace, like human petals around a flickering centre. The lucky ones get spots close enough to feel actual warmth on their faces. The unlucky ones huddle near the walls where draughts creep through every crack and crevice. The floor itself is your mattress stone, covered with a thin layer of rushes that have been trampled by hundreds of feet during the day. These rushes smell like a mixture of spilled ale, food scraps, dog urine, and the accumulated odours of daily castle life. But here's the thing. Even this disgusting carpet is better than sleeping on bare stone, because those dried plants trap tiny pockets of air that provide minimal insulation between your body and the thermal mass of the castle floor. Castle dogs were your bedmates and competitors for the best spots. Medieval households typically kept dozens of hunting hounds, guard dogs, and working animals, and these creatures knew exactly where the warmest places were. An experienced castle dog could navigate to the perfect sleeping spot, close enough to the fire for warmth, far enough away to avoid sparks positioned to catch any dropped food scraps. As a low-ranking servant, you had to negotiate with these animals for territory. Sometimes that meant sharing space with a mastiff who outweighed you by 50 pounds, or accepting that a pack of smaller dogs had claimed the prime real estate, and you'd have to settle for their leftovers. The social dynamics of floor sleeping followed brutal but logical rules. The most senior servants, perhaps the head cook or the lord's personal groom, got first choice of spots. They could claim space close to the fire and spread out their sleeping gear without interference. Below them came the regular household staff, then the seasonal workers, and finally the truly desperate travelling labourers, beggars granted temporary shelter, or servants who had fallen out of favour. But here's what's fascinating. Sleeping on the great hall floor often meant warmer nights than the servants' quarters upstairs. The massive central hearth was fed throughout the day, building up enormous heat in the surrounding stones. Even after the fire burned down to coals, the stone hearth continued radiating warmth for hours. The hall's high ceiling meant that heat rose away from the floor, but the sheer volume of thermal mass meant some residual warmth always remained. Your bedding was whatever you could scavenge. A worn-out cloak, a sack stuffed with straw scraps, maybe a thin blanket if you were lucky. Some servants learned to hoard materials during the day, save food scraps to trade for better sleeping spots, collect clean straw from the stables, gather rags that could be sewn together into makeshift covers. The economy of warmth operated on constant negotiation and bartering. The sensory experience of sleeping in the great hall was overwhelming. Dozens of people breathing, snoring, coughing, and shifting throughout the night. The smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, dog fur, and wood smoke. the sound of the fire crackling and popping, occasionally sending up showers of sparks that made everyone within range scramble to protect their bedding. The constant drip of condensation from the stone walls, the scratch of mice in the rushes, the occasional bark of a dog settling disputes over territory. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was purely practical, or served social control functions as well. Some suggest that making the lower servant sleep in public view was deliberate. It prevented theft, discouraged sexual liaisons, and maintained visible hierarchy. Others argue it was simply the most efficient use of available heat sources. Probably both factors played a role. Imagine yourself settling down on your pile of rags wedged between a snoring kitchen boy and a mastiff who's decided you're acceptable company. The stone floor is hard against your hip, the rushes poke through your thin covering, and every time you shift position the straw crackles loud enough to wake your neighbours. But gradually the ambient warmth from dozens of bodies and the dying fire creates a microclimate that's survivable, if not comfortable. The kitchen staff had one massive advantage over every other servant in the castle. They worked next to fires all day long, and they knew exactly how to turn that heat into portable survival tools. While other servants shivered in their quarters, the cooks, scullery maids and kitchen boys had developed an entire arsenal of clever warming techniques that would make modern survivalists jealous. The most ingenious trick was the heated stone system. Before heading to bed, kitchen workers would select smooth river rocks or flat pieces of stone and nestle them directly into the dying coals of the great kitchen fires. These weren't random stones they learned through painful trial and error which types could withstand intense heat without cracking or exploding. River stones were ideal because water had already tested them against thermal shock. Limestone was dangerous because it could fracture and send sharp fragments flying. Granite held heat well, but was heavy to carry up steep castle stairs. After roasting for hours in the kitchen fires, these stones became miniature furnaces. Using wooden tongs or wrapped in thick rags, kitchen workers would fish them out of the coals and carry them to their sleeping quarters like medieval heating pads. The trick was wrapping them properly too little cloth, and you'd burn yourself too much and the heat wouldn't transfer effectively. Most kitchen workers developed personal systems, old grain sacks doubled over strips of wool carefully layered, sometimes even small iron pots that could contain the stones safely. These heated stones could radiate warmth for 4 to 6 hours, long enough to get through the coldest part of the night. Kitchen maids would tuck them at the foot of their straw pallets, place them against their backs, or even hold them against their chests while falling asleep. The heat gradually seeped through their thin blankets, creating pockets of genuine warmth in otherwise freezing quarters. But stones weren't the only tool in their arsenal. Kitchen workers also mastered the art of fire banking, keeping coals alive overnight by carefully arranging them with ash and partially burned wood. Unlike other servants who had to depend on someone else to maintain fires, kitchen staff could ensure they always had access to heat sources. They'd bank fires in multiple hearths, creating backup warmth sources that could be revived with a few strategic pokes and fresh kindling. The kitchen staff also had access to warm food throughout the day, which gave them a metabolic advantage. While other servants might get one hot meal in the evening, cooks constantly sampled broths, warmed their hands around hot pots, and absorbed calories that helped their bodies generate heat. They knew which foods provided lasting warmth. Fatty stews, spiced ales, and hot porridges that kept their core temperatures higher than their colleagues who subsisted on cold bread and whatever scraps they could find. Some kitchen workers developed relationships with the castle's bakers, who had their own heating advantages. Bread ovens retained heat for hours after baking was finished, and savvy kitchen maids would negotiate for time near these ovens in exchange for help with cleaning or food preparation. A few minutes warming yourself against an oven that had been heated to bread baking temperatures could restore feeling to frozen fingers and toes. The more enterprising kitchen servants learned to coordinate their heating systems. They'd establish informal networks where someone with access to the main kitchen fires would heat stones for workers in the scullery who might not have direct access to the best coals. In return, scullery workers might share information about which storage areas stayed warmer or help carry heated stones to distant quarters where kitchen maids were housed. Historians still argue whether kitchen work was genuinely warmer, or whether kitchen workers just developed better survival strategies. Some evidence suggests that constantly working near fires gave kitchen staff mild burns and smoke-related health problems that actually made them more sensitive to cold. Other sources indicate that kitchen workers had lower rates of frostbite and cold-related illnesses, suggesting their heating strategies genuinely worked. Picture yourself as Agnes the kitchen maid whose hands are permanently stained with soot. Your day starts before dawn feeding fires and preparing the castle's breakfast. By evening you've absorbed heat from a dozen different sources, the main cooking fire, the bread ovens, the smaller fires used for specific preparations. Your clothes smell like smoke, your skin feels perpetually warm, and you've learned to read fires like other people read books. You know exactly when coals are perfect for heating stones, which logs will burn longest, and how to create the slow, steady heat that will keep you warm all night. Here's something that might shock you. Medieval servants often went to bed wearing more clothes than they wore during the day. Forget everything you know about pajamas, nightgowns, or sleeping naked under cozy blankets. When your bedroom is essentially a stone refrigerator, every piece of fabric you own becomes part of your survival strategy. Your typical servant's nighttime wardrobe started with the undertunic, a long linen shirt that served as both undergarment and sleepwear. But unlike the relatively fitted tunics worn during the day, sleeping tunics were deliberately oversized, designed to trap air pockets that would warm up from body heat. Over this went your regular wool tunic, the one you'd worked in all day, because taking it off meant losing a crucial layer of insulation. Then came the cloak, the medieval equivalent of a sleeping bag. These weren't the dramatic flowing cloaks you see in movies, they were practical wool rectangles, often patched and mended multiple times, that could wrap completely around your body. The best cloaks were made from felted wool that has been beaten and compressed until it was nearly waterproof, capable of blocking drafts and holding heat. A good cloak was a servant's most valuable possession, after their shoes and many wills from the period specifically mention passing cloaks down to younger family members. But the real genius was in the layers you couldn't see. Medieval people understood thermal dynamics in ways that would impress modern outdoor enthusiasts. They wore multiple thin layers rather than single thick ones, creating air pockets between fabrics that trapped warm air. A kitchen maid might wear linen against her skin, then wool, then another layer of linen, then wool again, building up a personal insulation system that could be adjusted throughout the night. The extremities got special attention because medieval people understood that losing heat through hands, feet, and head could kill you. Everyone slept wearing caps, not decorative headpieces, but practical wool or linen coverings that fit snugly around the skull. Some caps had ear flaps that could be tied under the chin. Others were simple tubes of fabric that could be pulled down to cover the neck. Losing body heat through your head wasn't just uncomfortable. It was genuinely dangerous in chambers where ambient temperatures hovered near freezing. feet required even more creative solutions. Most servants slept wearing their daytime footwear, leather shoes or boots that provided some protection against the stone floors, but the smart ones also wrapped their feet in additional fabric scraps, creating makeshift socks that added extra insulation. Some servants saved up to buy proper woolen hose, but these were expensive luxuries that most couldn't afford. Instead, they learned to layer strips of linen or wool around their feet and ankles, essentially creating custom foot warmers. Hands were protected with mittens or wrapped in rags because frostbitten fingers meant you couldn't work, and servants who couldn't work didn't eat. Some developed the trick of keeping their hands tucked inside their tunics while sleeping, using their body heat to warm their fingers. Others learned to sleep with their hands pressed against warm spots, their own torso, a heated stone, or even pressed against a sleeping partner's body. The challenge was that all these layers made movement difficult and sleep restless. Rolling over while wearing 3 tunics, a cloak wrapped feet mittens, and a cap required careful coordination. Too much shifting around and you'd pull layers apart, creating gaps where cold air could sneak in. Medieval sleepers learned to find comfortable positions and stay put, minimizing movement to preserve their carefully constructed thermal systems. Some servants developed personal rituals around getting dressed for bed. They'd layer clothing in specific orders, checking that each piece overlapped properly with the next. They'd adjust caps to cover ears, completely arrange cloaks to prevent gaps at the neck, and position wrapped feet to maximize contact with heated stones or warm bedmates. Getting ready for sleep was like putting on armor against the cold. Every piece had to be in exactly the right place. Historians still debate whether this heavy layering actually helped, or whether it just made people feel more secure. Some argue that wearing too many clothes could actually decrease warmth by restricting circulation and preventing natural body heat from distributing properly. Others point to survival evidence suggesting that servants who mastered layering techniques had better survival rates during harsh winters. The social aspect of clothing was important too. Servants who owned more layers had higher status within the servant hierarchy, and sharing clothing was a way of building alliances and ensuring group survival. A kitchen maid with an extra cloak might lend it to a stable boy in exchange for help with heavy lifting, or trade access to a warm cap for information about better sleeping spots. Picture yourself now methodically adding layers as the sun sets and the castle grows colder. First, the long linen under tunic, its rough fabric scratching against your skin but providing that crucial first barrier. Then your wool work tunic, still smelling of the day's labour but warm from your body heat. Over that, a second wool layer. If you're lucky enough to own one, then finally your cloak wrapped carefully to overlap and seal out drafts. Your hands disappear into mittens or cloth wrappings. Your feet are swaddled in layers of fabric scraps, and your cap is pulled down to cover your ears and neck. You look more like a bundle of rags than a person, but when you finally settle onto your straw pallet, you're carrying your own personal heating system built from whatever fabric scraps and cast-off clothing you've managed to collect over months or years of careful acquisition. While most servants shivered through the night in static positions trying to conserve heat under thin blankets, one group of castle workers had a crucial advantage: they had to keep moving. The night shift guards, watchmen, and the servants who maintained essential services discovered that motion itself was a powerful weapon against the deadly cold. Castle guards walking their rounds on the walls and battlements faced the harshest conditions of anyone in the fortress. Exposed to wind, rain, and snow, they couldn't rely on fires or shared body heat. But they developed something even better, a systematic approach to staying warm through constant movement. A guard's route wasn't just about security, it was choreographed survival. The walking patterns guards developed were based on generations of trial and error, passed down from veteran watchmen to newcomers who wanted to survive their first winter. They learned to time their pace to maintain circulation without exhausting themselves, to swing their arms in specific ways that kept blood flowing to their fingers, and to pause at strategic intervals where stone walls or corners provided brief shelter from the wind. Night guards also mastered the art of layered movement. They'd start their shift with vigorous activity, checking locks, examining equipment, walking briskly along their assigned routes to build up internal heat. As their bodies warmed, they'd slow to a steady pace that maintained their core temperature without causing excessive sweating, which could later freeze against their skin. The guards developed informal partnerships where they'd meet at predetermined points to check on each other's condition. A guard showing signs of hypothermia, slurred, speech confusion, stumbling would be pulled from duty immediately. These weren't acts of kindness, they were survival protocols. A guard who froze to death at his post left a gap in the castle's defences that could be exploited by enemies. But it wasn't just the exterior guards who used movement as heating strategy. Night shift servants working inside the castle, the baker's assistants who tended ovens through the dark hours, the stable hands who checked on animals, the kitchen workers who prepared early morning meals, all discovered that staying busy meant staying alive. The night bakers had perhaps the best deal of any nocturnal worker. They worked next to ovens that had to maintain consistent heat for bread production, and their work required constant physical activity, kneading dough, lifting heavy sacks of grain, stoking fires, moving hot pans. But even they couldn't remain stationary. Between batches of bread, they'd walk circuits around the kitchen, checking storage areas, cleaning equipment and maintaining the fires that would keep them warm until dawn. Stable hands developed their own movement rituals. Horses and other livestock generated considerable heat, but the stables were drafty and exposed to exterior walls. Night shift stable workers learned to time their rounds to coincide with animal behavior. Horses shift and move throughout the night, generating bursts of heat that smart stable hands could take advantage of. They'd check each animal not just for health, but to absorb warmth from large bodies that radiated heat like living furnaces. Some night workers developed elaborate exercise routines that they could perform in small spaces without making enough noise to wake sleeping residents. These weren't formal calisthenics, they were practical movements designed to keep blood circulating. Arm swings, gentle leg lifts, subtle stretching and controlled breathing exercises that could be done while maintaining watch duties. The night shift also had access to warming strategies unavailable to daytime workers. They could build up fires without competition. They could move freely through areas that were crowded during the day, and they could take advantage of residual heat from cooking fires and blacksmith forges that retained warmth hours after active use. Historians still argue whether night duty was genuinely warmer or whether the constant activity just made cold more bearable. Some evidence suggests that night workers had higher caloric requirements because they burned more energy staying warm, but also that they had lower rates of cold-related injuries because movement prevented the kind of extreme temperature drops that caused frostbite and hypothermia. But there were serious downsides to the night shift advantage. Constant movement was exhausting, and workers who couldn't maintain their pace throughout the entire night were at risk of sudden temperature crashes when their activity levels dropped. Night shift workers also faced the psychological challenge of staying alert and active when their bodies naturally wanted to sleep, leading to accidents and poor decision-making that could have fatal consequences. Picture yourself as a castle guard walking your assigned route along the outer walls. The wind cuts through your cloak like it's made of paper, and your breath forms ice crystals that cling to your beard. But you keep moving 50 paces to the corner tower, pause to check the courtyard below. 50 paces back along the opposite wall. Your feet are numb inside your boots, but your legs stay warm from the constant walking. You've learned to time your breathing with your steps, to swing your arms in ways that keep your shoulders loose, and to shift your grip on your spear regularly, so your hands don't freeze to the metal. Every hour you meet William at the south gate, where you both pause for a few minutes in the shelter of the gatehouse, sharing a drink from a flask of watered wine that helps keep your core temperature up. Now let's talk about one of the most brutal realities of medieval castle life. The architecture itself was actively working against human comfort. Those magnificent stone walls that tourists admire today weren't just defensive barriers, they were essentially building-sized refrigerators that trapped cold air and radiated it back at anyone unfortunate enough to live inside them. Medieval castle builders were brilliant military engineers, but they understood absolutely nothing about thermal dynamics. When they designed walls 12 feet thick, they were thinking about stopping battering rams and catapult stones, not about how stone absorbs and holds cold temperatures. Those same walls that could shrug off a siege engine also created what modern engineers would recognize as massive thermal mass systems, enormous stone structures that absorbed cold during winter nights and then slowly radiated it back into living spaces for hours afterward. The physics working against castle residents were relentless. Stone has high thermal mass, meaning it takes a lot of energy to change its temperature, but once it gets cold, it stays cold for a very long time. During winter days, when weak sunlight might briefly warm the exterior walls, that heat would be absorbed into the massive stone structure and never make it to the interior surfaces. At night, when temperatures dropped, the stones would continue radiating cold inward, essentially turning every room into a stone-lined icebox. Castle windows made the problem worse. Most medieval windows were narrow slits designed for defense, not illumination or ventilation. These arrow slits created venturi effects, narrow openings that accelerated wind speed and drove cold air deep into the castle's interior spaces. Even when windows had shutters, the gaps around wooden frames allowed constant air infiltration. Glass windows were expensive luxuries that most castles couldn't afford, so windows were often covered with oiled parchment or thin horn that provided minimal insulation against outdoor temperatures. The worst part was that heat naturally rises, so even when fireplaces managed to warm the air in a room that heated air, immediately rose toward the high stone ceilings and disappeared. Medieval chambers typically had ceiling heights of 12 to 20 feet. Impressive for display purposes, but thermal disasters for anyone trying to stay warm. The usable heat from fires remained in a thin layer near the floor, while the vast majority of each room's air volume stayed freezing cold. Doorways created additional thermal challenges. Medieval doors were often massive wooden barriers designed to withstand attacks, but they rarely fitted tightly in their frames. The gaps around doors allowed constant cold air infiltration, and every time a door opened it created pressure differentials that sucked warm air out of rooms and pulled cold air in. Stone doorways conducted cold directly from exterior walls to interior spaces, creating thermal bridges that made heating individual rooms nearly impossible. Castle builders gradually learned some thermal lessons, but their priorities always remained military rather than residential. Some later castles included smaller chambers within larger structures, essentially building rooms inside rooms to create more manageable heating spaces. Others experimented with internal courtyards that could trap and warm air or with positioning living quarters on upper floors where they'd be slightly more protected from ground-level cold and moisture. But even these improvements were limited by the fundamental physics of stone construction. No amount of tapestries, rushes, or interior wood panelling could overcome the basic problem that castles were enormous stone heat sinks that absorbed warmth during the day and radiated cold at night. The very features that made castles militarily effective, thick walls, small windows, massive doors, made them thermally hostile to human habitation. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood these thermal dynamics or simply accepted them as inevitable consequences of defensive architecture. Some evidence suggests that castle builders gradually learned to orient buildings to maximize solar gain, to position living quarters away from prevailing winds, and to design smaller, more easily heated private chambers. Other sources indicate that comfort remained secondary to defence throughout the medieval period, with residents expected to adapt to whatever conditions their fortifications provided. The social implications were significant too. The architectural challenges of castle heating reinforced social hierarchies. Those with access to better rooms, more fuel and personal servants for fire maintenance had dramatically better survival chances than those relegated to the coldest, most exposed quarters. Castle design essentially institutionalized thermal inequality, creating built-in advantages for higher-ranking residents and systematic disadvantages for servants and lower-status inhabitants. Picture yourself standing in a typical castle chamber in January. The stone walls rise around you like cliffs, their surfaces slick with condensation, because the stone is so cold that moisture from your breath immediately condenses when it touches the walls. The floor beneath your feet conducts cold directly through your leather shoes, numbing your toes despite thick woolen stockings. Even with a fire blazing in the hearth, you can feel the cold radiating from the walls behind you. The heat from the flames reaches only a few feet into the room before being absorbed by the stone mass surrounding you. Every breath you take creates visible vapor clouds, and every surface you touch, door handles, furniture, even fabric that's been hanging near the walls, feels cold enough to burn your fingers. Now we need to talk about one of the most dangerous aspects of medieval castle life in winter: the underground economy of warmth, where fuel became so precious that stealing it could get you hanged, and every stick of kindling was worth more than a day's wages. Firewood in a medieval castle wasn't just a convenience, it was literally the difference between life and death, which made it one of the most tightly controlled resources in the entire fortress. The castle's fuel supplies were managed with military precision, because running out of firewood during a harsh winter could kill more people than any siege. This created a complex hierarchy of fuel access that reinforced social structures and spawned an entire shadow economy of theft, black market trading, and desperate survival strategies. The Lord's Solar and Great Hall got first priority for the best fuel-seasoned hardwood that burned long and hot, producing maximum heat with minimal smoke. The kitchen hearths received the second-tier good wood for cooking fires that had to maintain consistent temperatures. Lower-ranking chambers got whatever remained green wood that smoked terribly scraps from construction projects, or even compressed peat and dried dung when wood supplies ran critically low. Servants lived at the bottom of this fuel hierarchy, often competing for kitchen scraps, wood shavings, sawdust bark, and the charcoal remnants from the blacksmith's forge. But even these scraps were valuable enough to fight over. A handful of dry kindling could mean the difference between a night of survivable discomfort and potentially fatal hypothermia. This scarcity created opportunities for theft that desperate servants couldn't resist. Firewood was stockpiled in castle courtyard storage rooms and designated fuel sheds, but it was impossible to guard every piece of wood every hour of the day. Servants developed elaborate schemes for pilfering fuel-hiding pieces of kindling in their clothing, while working slowly accumulating small caches of stolen wood in hidden locations, or coordinating with other servants to create distractions while someone grabbed fuel from the main stores. The penalties for fuel theft were severe because castle administrators understood that unchecked stealing could compromise the entire heating system. Getting caught stealing firewood could result in public flogging, loss of employment, or even hanging for repeat offenders. Some castle records show servants being branded on the hand for wood theft, a permanent mark that would make it impossible to find work elsewhere. But desperation made people take risks that logic would normally prevent. Thomas the stable boy might notice a piece of seasoned oak that had fallen near the woodpile, technically not yet stolen, but clearly destined for the Lord's chambers. The moral calculation was brutal: steal the wood and risk punishment, or spend another night shivering while his fingers went numb with cold. Many servants chose the risk, especially when they had sick children or elderly relatives who wouldn't survive another freezing night. Castle administrators tried various strategies to prevent fuel theft. Some appointed specific guards to watch the wood stores, others implemented rationing systems that gave each servant a measured allotment of fuel. A few castles tried rotating storage locations, moving wood supplies frequently, so thieves couldn't predict where to find fuel. But servants were resourceful and desperate, and they usually found ways around these security measures. The black market for fuel operated through informal networks of trust and desperation. A kitchen maid with access to extra kindling might trade it to a stable hand for warmer sleeping spots near the horses. Servants might pool their legitimate fuel allowances to help someone whose relative was sick. Some developed relationships with woodcutters or charcoal burners who worked outside the castle trading services or food for extra fuel that wouldn't be missed from official supplies. Castle records show fascinating glimpses of this underground economy. Account books sometimes mention fuel losses due to waste, or wood consumed beyond estimates, euphemisms that likely concealed theft. Some inventories show suspiciously rapid depletion of fuel supplies, suggesting systematic pilfering that administrators couldn't prevent but also couldn't officially acknowledge. The social dynamics around fuel theft were complex. Servants who hoarded fuel were resented by others, but they were also respected for their survival skills. Those who shared stolen fuel gained allies and built support networks that could be crucial during medical emergencies or other crises. Getting caught stealing could destroy someone's reputation, but successfully providing warmth for family members earned social capital that could last years. Historians still argue whether fuel theft was primarily individual desperation or organized group activity. Some evidence suggests elaborate conspiracies where groups of servants coordinated their theft activities, creating informal supply chains that moved stolen fuel from storage areas to those who needed it most. Other sources indicate that most theft was opportunistic and individual, driven by immediate need rather than long-term planning. Picture yourself as Agnes, the kitchen maid, whose hands are perpetually stained with soot. You know exactly where the choice pieces of kindling are stored because you help move them from the courtyard to the various hearths throughout the castle. You also know which guards are sympathetic to servants, which storage areas are poorly watched, and which other servants might be willing to share fuel in exchange for extra food or other favours. Tonight little Mary, who tends the hounds, is shivering so violently that she can barely hold her eating bowl steady. You've seen servants die from cold before they just get weaker and weaker until they stop waking up one morning. So you make a decision that could get you flogged or branded but might save Mary's life. You slip 3 pieces of good kindling into your skirts while cleaning the Great Hall, then smuggle them to Mary's sleeping area after the evening meal. Medieval people had some truly bizarre ideas about how cold affected the human body, and their medical theories shaped everything from sleeping positions to the foods they ate before bed. Understanding these beliefs helps explain why servants made some of the seemingly strange survival choices. They did choices that were actually based on the cutting-edge medical science of their time, however wrong it might seem to us now. The foundation of medieval medicine was the theory of the 4 humours: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and medieval physicians believed that illness resulted from imbalances between these humours. Cold weather was thought to dramatically increase the body's phlegm, which was considered cold and moist, potentially overwhelming the other humours, and causing everything from simple chills to fatal illnesses. This theory led to some fascinating survival strategies. Medieval people believed that eating hot foods before bed could counteract the cold humour that winter introduced to their bodies. Foods weren't classified as hot or cold based on temperature, but on their supposed effect on the body's internal balance. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and pepper were considered extremely hot, while most vegetables and fruits were thought to be cold. This meant that servants who could access spiced ale or wine before bed weren't just seeking comfort, they were following medical advice designed to prevent hypothermia and winter illness. The breathing techniques that medieval people used in cold bedrooms were also based on humoral theory. They believed that cold air entering the lungs could directly cool the blood, which would then carry coldness throughout the body. This led to practices like breathing through fabric, sleeping with faces covered, or taking shallow breaths when the air was extremely cold. Some servants learned to warm their breath by holding it briefly before exhaling, thinking this would prevent cold air from penetrating too deeply into their bodies. Medieval physicians also believed that different parts of the body were more susceptible to cold than others. The head was considered especially vulnerable because it was thought to be the primary location of the body's natural heat. This is why medieval people were obsessed with head coverings during sleep. They genuinely believed that most body heat escaped through the skull, making nightcaps a medical necessity, rather than just a comfort item. The feet and hands were thought to be the body's extremities, where cold could enter and travel inward toward vital organs. Medieval medical text recommended specific warming techniques for these areas: rubbing with rough cloth to stimulate circulation, soaking in warm water when available, and wrapping in wool that had been treated with herbs thought to generate heat. Some servants learned to massage their own feet and hands before bed, following medical advice that manual stimulation could prevent cold from settling in their extremities. Medieval people also had elaborate theories about the relationship between sleep position and body temperature. They believed that lying flat on your back allowed cold air to penetrate the body more easily, while side sleeping with knees drawn up created a more defensive posture against cold. This led to specific sleeping positions that servants adopted not just for comfort, but because they thought these positions would help them survive the night. The timing of sleep was also influenced by medical beliefs about cold. Medieval physicians thought that the body's natural heat was strongest during certain hours and weakest during others. The period between midnight and dawn was considered especially dangerous, because the body's heat was thought to be at its lowest ebb. This belief encouraged the practice of segmented sleep, waking up during the coldest part of the night to tend fires, move around, or perform warming exercises before returning to bed. Medieval medicine also prescribed specific remedies for cold-related illnesses that servants could sometimes access. Heated wine with honey and spices was thought to directly counteract cold humours. Garlic was considered a powerful warming agent that could prevent cold from penetrating the body. Even simple warm water was thought to have medicinal properties when consumed before bed, helping to balance the body's internal temperature. Some of these remedies seem almost modern in their effectiveness, even if the underlying theory was wrong. Drinking warm liquids before bed does help maintain core body temperature. Covering the head does prevent significant heat loss. Exercise and massage do improve circulation and help prevent frostbite. Medieval people stumbled onto genuinely effective survival techniques, even though their explanations for why these techniques worked were completely incorrect. But medieval medical theory also led to some practices that were genuinely dangerous. Some physicians recommended bleeding patients who showed signs of cold-related illness, believing that removing excess cold humours would restore balance. This practice actually made hypothermia worse by reducing the body's ability to maintain core temperature. Other treatments involve purging the digestive system, which could leave cold victims even weaker and less able to generate body heat. The social aspects of medieval medicine also affected how servants dealt with cold. Medical knowledge was closely guarded by educated physicians who served the nobility, but servants developed their own folk medicine traditions based on practical experience and garbled versions of humoral theory. These folk remedies were passed down through generations of servants and often proved more effective than the formal medical treatments available to their social superiors. Historians still argue about how much medieval people actually believed in humoral theory versus how much they simply accepted it as the best explanation available. Some evidence suggests that servants modified medical advice based on practical experience, keeping the parts that seemed to work while quietly ignoring recommendations that proved ineffective or dangerous. Picture yourself as a servant who's just learned that little Mary has developed the telltale signs of what medieval people called cold sickness: blue fingertips, constant shivering, and difficulty thinking clearly. Based on your understanding of humoral medicine, you know that her body's cold humours have become dangerously unbalanced. You need to introduce heat to counteract the cold, but you have limited resources. You remember that the kitchen sometimes has leftover spiced ale, which your grandmother taught you was the most effective remedy for cold sickness. You manage to convince the cook to give you a small cup of warm ale with ginger, and you help Mary drink it slowly while you massage her hands and feet to encourage the warm humours to circulate properly. You wrap her head more completely because you know that's where most of her body's heat is escaping, and you help her assume the side sleeping position that's supposed to protect against cold air penetration. Here's where medieval survival gets really interesting and a little smelly. When you're desperate for warmth in a stone fortress that's essentially a giant refrigerator, you learn to form alliances with every warm-blooded creature in the castle. Animals weren't just pets or livestock. They were living, breathing heating systems that could mean the difference between waking up with all your fingers or counting fewer than 10 in the morning. Dogs were the ultimate survival partners. Castle hounds weren't the pampered lapdogs we know today. They were working animals bred for hunting, guarding, and war. But they had one quality that made them invaluable to freezing servants. They were furry furnaces that radiated heat all night long. A large mastiff could generate enough body heat to warm a small sleeping area, and their thick coats trapped warm air that could be shared with human bedmates. The relationship between servants and castle dogs was symbiotic in the truest sense. Dogs needed warm, safe places to sleep just as much as humans did, and they were smart enough to seek out the spots where multiple humans were already huddled together. Servants in turn welcomed canine company because dogs could significantly raise the temperature of shared sleeping spaces. A servant sleeping alone might struggle to survive a particularly cold night, but the same servant with a large dog pressed against their back could maintain enough core body temperature to make it until morning. The phrase, three-dog night, might come from much later folklore, but the concept was absolutely real in medieval times. On the coldest nights, servants would gather as many dogs as possible into their sleeping areas. 3 large dogs meant enough collective body heat to create a genuinely warm micro-environment, even in chambers where you could see your breath. The dogs would instinctively pile together, creating a warm mass that humans could join, essentially turning sleeping areas into interspecies survival huddles. Cats played a different but equally important role in the castle heating ecosystem. While dogs provided substantial heat, cats were precision warmers. They sought out the warmest spots with scientific accuracy and could fit into small spaces where dogs couldn't go. A cat curled against your chest or stomach could warm your core in ways that larger animals couldn't manage. Cats also had the advantage of being cleaner than dogs, making them more acceptable sleeping partners for servants who were already dealing with difficult hygiene conditions. But castle servants didn't limit themselves to traditional pets. Horses were walk-in heat generators that could warm an entire stable, and smart, stable hands learned to time their own sleep cycles to coincide with the horses' rest periods. Sleeping in a stall with horses meant breathing air that was significantly warmer than the exterior temperature, and the large animals blocked wind and drafts that would otherwise make sleep impossible. Some of the more desperate or creative servants even befriended the castle's rats. This might sound revolting to modern sensibilities, but rats are actually quite warm, and a few small warm bodies tucked into your clothing could provide crucial extra heat on the coldest nights. Rats were also smart enough to seek out the warmest hiding places, so following them could lead servants to discover heated spots they might not have found otherwise. The social dynamics of animal relationships were fascinating. Servants who successfully cultivated friendships with the castle's animals had significant survival advantages, but they also had to navigate complex hierarchies. The lord's hunting hounds might be off limits to common servants, while the kitchen cats belonged to the cooking staff and weren't available for general heating purposes. Understanding which animals you could approach and which ones were reserved for higher-ranking castle residents was crucial social knowledge. Some animals were specifically valued for their warming properties. Sheep produced both wool and body heat, and sleeping near sheep pens could provide life-saving warmth. Goats were hardy animals that could survive harsh conditions while still generating significant heat. Even chickens, despite their small size, could contribute to warming efforts. A few chickens roosting in a small space could raise the ambient temperature noticeably. Historians still argue about how widespread interspecies sleeping arrangements actually were. Some evidence suggests that allowing animals into sleeping areas was common practice, especially in frontier castles where survival took precedence over social niceties. Other sources indicate that sleeping with animals was considered undignified and was practiced only by the most desperate servants. The truth probably varied by region, social class, and individual circumstances. The health implications were significant. Sleeping with animals meant sharing fleas, lice, and other parasites which could spread diseases and make already difficult conditions worse. But the alternative freezing to death made these health risks acceptable trade-offs for most servants. Medieval people had different standards of cleanliness anyway, and a few extra fleas were considered minor inconveniences compared to hypothermia. Picture yourself as Thomas the stable boy, whose work keeps him in close contact with the castle's horses throughout the day. You've developed relationships with several of the warmer, gentler animals, and you know which horses generate the most heat and which stalls stay warmest throughout the night. When the temperature drops to dangerous levels, you make your way to the stall where Magnus, a massive draft horse, spends his nights. Magnus has learned to expect your presence on the coldest evenings, and he doesn't mind when you curl up against his flank, using his body heat to warm yourself through the night. The stable smells of hay, horse sweat and manure, but it's significantly warmer than your assigned sleeping quarters. Magnus's breathing creates a rhythm that helps you relax, and his massive body blocks the drafts that would otherwise make sleep impossible. You wake up covered in horsehair and smelling like the stables, but you wake up alive with all your fingers and toes intact. Now let's venture into one of the most desperate and dangerous heating strategies that medieval castle servants sometimes employed, using the castle's latrines as improvised sleeping quarters. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval bathrooms became survival shelters for the most desperate servants during the harshest winter nights. Medieval castle latrines called garderobes were typically built into the thick castle walls, with chutes that dropped waste directly into moats, rivers, or specially constructed waste pits below. But here's the crucial detail that made them attractive to freezing servants. They were often slightly warmer than other castle spaces, because they were built into interior walls and sometimes positioned near kitchen areas, where residual heat from cooking fires could warm the stone. The physics of garderobe construction inadvertently created microclimates that desperate servants could exploit. Many garderobes were built as small chambers carved directly into castle walls, which meant they were partially sheltered from exterior wind and weather. The stone surrounding these spaces absorbed heat from adjacent rooms during the day and radiated it back slowly at night. For a servant facing the prospect of sleeping in a completely unheated chamber, even a few degrees of extra warmth could mean the difference between survival and hypothermia. But using latrines as sleeping spaces required careful timing and considerable desperation. Servants had to wait until the garderobe wasn't in active use, which usually meant the middle of the night when most castle residents were asleep. They also had to deal with the overwhelming smell and the genuine health risks of sleeping in spaces contaminated with human waste. Medieval people had different standards of hygiene than we do, but even they understood that prolonged exposure to waste could cause illness. The social risks were enormous. Getting caught sleeping in a garderobe could result in immediate dismissal, public humiliation, or physical punishment. Castle administrators viewed such behaviour as evidence of moral degradation, and servants who were discovered using latrines as sleeping quarters were often assumed to be thieves, troublemakers, or people with such poor character that they couldn't be trusted with any responsibilities. Some servants developed strategies for minimizing the risks while still accessing the relative warmth of garderobe spaces. They might bring materials to create barriers between themselves and the actual waste areas, using straw or rags to create makeshift sleeping surfaces that kept them off the stone floors while still allowing them to benefit from the marginally warmer air. Others learned to identify garderobes that were rarely used or positioned in locations where discovery was less likely. These social hierarchies around garderobe access were complex Some of the larger, better-positioned guardrobes were reserved for higher-ranking castle residents, making them both warmer and more dangerous for servants to use without permission. Smaller, more poorly designed latrines might be available to servants, but offered fewer heating advantages. Understanding which spaces you could safely access and which ones would result in severe punishment was crucial survival knowledge. Medieval castle design sometimes inadvertently created opportunities for this kind of desperate heating strategy. Guardrobes positioned near kitchen areas above brewing rooms or adjacent to other heated spaces could be significantly warmer than chambers designed specifically for servants sleeping. Some of the more enterprising servants learned to read castle architecture, identifying which latrines might offer the best combination of warmth and safety. The health consequences of sleeping in waste-contaminated spaces were serious, but medieval servants facing hypothermia often considered them acceptable risks. Diseases transmitted through contact with human waste could cause serious illness or death, but freezing to death was a more immediate and certain threat. Many servants who resorted to sleeping in guardrobes did so only on the coldest nights, when alternative heating strategies had failed. Some castle administrators tacitly acknowledged this desperate practice without officially approving it. Records occasionally mention servants found sleeping in inappropriate locations during harsh winters with punishments that seem relatively mild considering the supposed severity of the offence. This suggests that some authorities understood the survival pressures that drove servants to seek warmth in degrading locations. The psychological impact of sleeping in latrines was significant. Servants who resorted to such measures often described feelings of humiliation and desperation that could affect their mental health and social relationships. Being reduced to sleeping in waste areas was seen as evidence of complete social failure, even when it was simply a survival strategy employed by people who had run out of alternatives. Historians still debate how common this practice actually was. Some argue that sleeping in guardrobes was extremely rare and limited to the most desperate circumstances, citing the health risks and social stigma as deterrents. Others suggest that it was more widespread than records indicate, since servants who used latrines as sleeping quarters had strong incentives to keep such behaviour secret. The architectural evidence is ambiguous. Some castle guardrobes show signs of modification that might indicate use as sleeping spaces, additional straw or fabric materials, small personal items, or wear patterns that suggest prolonged human presence. But these modifications could also result from other uses, and it's difficult to definitively prove that servants used latrines as regular sleeping quarters. Modern castle restorations have revealed some guardrobes that would have been surprisingly comfortable as emergency shelters. Well-positioned latrines with good drainage stone seats that could serve as sleeping platforms and walls that absorbed heat from adjacent spaces might have offered genuine survival advantages to desperate servants. The key was finding latrines that provided warmth without excessive health risks. Picture yourself as a servant who has exhausted all other heating options. Your assigned sleeping quarters are so cold that ice forms on the walls. Your straw pallet provides no insulation against the stone floor, and you've already developed the early signs of frostbite on your fingers and toes. Walking through the castle in the middle of the night, you remember hearing other servants whisper about guardrobes that stay warmer than other spaces. You locate a guardrobe that's positioned near the kitchen area, where residual heat from the day's cooking fires has warmed the surrounding stone. The smell is overwhelming, but the air temperature is noticeably higher than the corridor outside. You spread your cloak on the stone seat, creating a barrier between yourself and the waste area, and curl up in the small chamber. It's degrading and dangerous, but for the first time in days, you stop shivering. You manage a few hours of actual sleep before dawn forces you to return to your official quarters, hoping no one notices where you've been. The true genius of medieval castle survival lay not in individual strategies, but in the communal warming rituals that servants developed in formal social customs that transformed individual desperation into collective survival systems. These weren't official castle policies or noble traditions. They were grassroots innovations created by people who understood that cooperation could mean the difference between everyone freezing or everyone surviving until spring. The most sophisticated of these rituals was something historians call thermal sharing cycles, coordinated systems where servants took turns providing different types of warmth support for the group. Agnes, the kitchen maid, with her access to heated stones and warm food, might provide heated objects for the group on Mondays and Thursdays. Thomas, the stable boy, with his knowledge of animal heat sources, would guide others to the warmest animal sleeping spots on Tuesdays and Fridays. Mary, who tended the hunting hounds, could arrange for dog companionship on the coldest nights. These sharing systems required sophisticated social coordination. Servants had to track who had contributed what resources, ensure that the neediest members received priority access to the best warming opportunities, and maintain the secrecy necessary to prevent castle administrators from discovering and disrupting their survival networks. The social bonds created by these arrangements often lasted years, creating castle subcultures based on mutual survival support. Food sharing was a crucial component of communal warming rituals. Servants who had access to hot meals would save portions for others who worked in colder areas of the castle. Kitchen workers might prepare extra servings of warm porridge or heated ales specifically for distribution to servants whose duties kept them away from cooking fires. The calories from warm food provided internal heat that could sustain people through hours of cold exposure, making food sharing a form of indirect heating support. Clothing rotation was another essential communal warming practice. Servants who owned extra cloaks, blankets, or woolen garments would lend them to others on the coldest nights, creating informal clothing libraries that maximize the heating potential of limited textile resources. These arrangements required careful social negotiation: who got access to the warmest clothes for how long and under what circumstances, but they could significantly improve survival chances for entire groups of servants. The timing of these communal rituals was carefully coordinated with castle schedules and weather patterns. Servants learned to predict which nights would be the coldest, and began preparing their collective warming strategies days in advance. They would coordinate work schedules to ensure that someone with access to heated stones would be available when temperatures dropped, or arrange for multiple people to tend fires in shifts so that no one had to face the cold alone. Information sharing was perhaps the most valuable aspect of these communal warming systems. Servants developed sophisticated networks for communicating about heating opportunities, which rooms stayed warmest when fires would be available in different areas, where animals could be found for heat sharing, and which castle spaces offered unexpected shelter from cold and wind. This knowledge was passed down from experienced servants to newcomers, creating institutional memory that could save lives. The social hierarchies within servant communities affected how warming resources were distributed. Experienced servants who knew the castle's heating secrets might trade that knowledge for other favours or resources. Servants with specialised skills, like those who could repair heating equipment or maintain fires, gained higher status within the community, because their abilities benefited everyone. These hierarchies weren't based on official castle ranks, but on practical survival contributions. Some of the most elaborate communal warming rituals involved coordinated sleeping arrangements that maximised shared body heat. Groups of servants would arrange their sleeping schedules so that the warmest sleepers surrounded those who had trouble staying warm. They developed systems for rotating sleeping positions throughout the night, ensuring that everyone got some time in the warm centre of group sleeping arrangements. Communal fire maintenance was another crucial survival ritual. Rather than each servant trying to maintain individual heating sources, groups would coordinate to keep shared fires burning throughout the night. They would take turns waking up to add fuel stoke embers and ensure that fires didn't die out completely. These arrangements required enormous trust since everyone's survival depended on each person fulfilling their fire-tending responsibilities. The spiritual aspect of communal warming rituals was significant too. Many servant groups developed shared prayer songs or storytelling traditions that helped them endure cold nights together. These practices weren't just psychological comfort, they were social bonding activities that reinforced the cooperation necessary for survival. Servants who felt connected to their survival groups were more likely to share resources and support each other through difficult nights. Historians still debate whether these communal warming systems developed spontaneously, or whether they were influenced by religious or cultural traditions about community cooperation. Some evidence suggests that servants adapted monastic practices of communal living, while other sources indicate that these survival systems developed independently based on practical necessity. The truth probably varies by region and castle, but the underlying principle that collective action could overcome individual limitations appears consistently across medieval survival records. The seasonal nature of these rituals was important too. As winter approached, servant communities would begin planning their collective warming strategies, stockpiling shared resources, and establishing the social agreements necessary for resource sharing. As spring returned, these arrangements would gradually dissolve, only to be renewed the following winter when survival pressures returned. Picture yourself joining one of these communal warming circles for the first time. You're new to the castle, and the other servants are evaluating whether you can be trusted with their survival secrets. Agnes asks whether you know how to bank fires properly, a skill that could benefit the entire group. Thomas wants to know if you're willing to share any animal heat sources you discover. Mary watches to see whether you'll hoard resources for yourself or contribute to the group's collective survival. Over the course of several cold nights, you prove that you're willing to share the warm stones you heat in the kitchen fires, and you demonstrate that you can maintain group fires without letting them die out during your watch shifts. Gradually, you're accepted into the informal survival network, gaining access to shared warming resources and becoming part of a community that transforms individual desperation into collective resilience. Now we come to the darkest reality of medieval castle life. Not everyone made it through the winter. The grim arithmetic of survival meant that castle communities regularly lost members to cold-related deaths, and servants learned to live with the constant awareness that they might not see spring. Understanding these mortality rates helps us appreciate just how desperate and dangerous medieval winter survival really was. These statistics, when they exist, are sobering. Records from some English castles suggest that servant mortality rates could increase by 30-50% during particularly harsh winters. These weren't battlefield casualties or plague deaths. They were people who simply couldn't generate enough heat to keep their bodies functioning through months of sustained cold exposure. Young children, elderly servants, and anyone already weakened by poor nutrition or illness were especially vulnerable. medieval people developed a grim vocabulary around winter death that reveals how common these losses were. They spoke of people being claimed by the cold or taken by frost, using language that suggested winter was an active predator stalking castle corridors. Servants who survived harsh winters often described themselves as winter lucky or cold blessed, acknowledging that survival was as much about chance as skill. The causes of cold-related death were varied and often interrelated. Hypothermia was the most obvious killer. When core body temperature dropped below sustainable levels, vital organs simply stopped functioning. But malnutrition made hypothermia more likely, since undernourished bodies couldn't generate the calories necessary to maintain internal heat. Respiratory infections flourished in cold, damp conditions and could kill people whose immune systems were already compromised by cold stress. Frostbite was another major cause of winter mortality, though it often killed indirectly. Servants who lost fingers or toes to frostbite couldn't work effectively, which meant they couldn't earn food or maintain access to heated spaces. The infection that often followed severe frostbite could be fatal, especially in an era without antibiotics or modern medical care. Some servants who survived frostbite were left permanently disabled, unable to continue their work, and essentially condemned to slower death by starvation. The social aspects of winter mortality were particularly cruel. Servants who became too weak to work were often expelled from castles since they consumed resources without contributing labour. This created a vicious cycle where cold-related illness led to loss of shelter, which led to more severe cold exposure and almost certain death. Some castle communities developed informal systems for supporting disabled or weakened members, but these arrangements were fragile and couldn't always prevent winter deaths. Age-related mortality patterns revealed the brutal reality of medieval heating systems. Very young servants often died because their small bodies couldn't generate enough heat to survive in unheated chambers. Elderly servants faced the double challenge of reduced metabolism and decreased mobility, making it harder for them to access warming resources or maintain the physical activity necessary to stay warm. The age range with the best survival chances was roughly 16 to 40, when bodies were large enough to generate significant heat, but still healthy enough to endure harsh conditions. Gender differences in winter mortality were complex. Female servants sometimes had better survival rates, because their work often kept them near kitchen fires, and because they were more likely to be assigned indoor duties. Male servants who worked outdoors or in unheated areas like stables and guard posts faced higher mortality risks. But female servants who became pregnant during winter faced enormous survival challenges, since pregnancy increased caloric needs while potentially limiting access to work and resources. The timing of winter deaths followed predictable patterns. The highest mortality occurred during the coldest months, usually January and February, when fuel supplies were running low and accumulated cold stress reached critical levels. Early winter deaths often resulted from accidents, people falling through ice, or being caught unprepared by sudden temperature drops. Late winter deaths were more likely to result from gradual deterioration, as months of insufficient heating and poor nutrition finally overwhelmed people's survival resources. Castle administrators learned to anticipate winter mortality and plan accordingly. Some castle records show provisions for replacing servants who were expected to die during winter months. This cold calculation wasn't necessarily heartless. It was practical planning based on statistical realities. Castles that didn't prepare for servant turnover could find themselves dangerously understaffed by spring, unable to maintain essential operations. The psychological impact of winter mortality on surviving servants was enormous. People lived with constant awareness that they might not survive until spring, which created both desperation and a particular kind of fatalism. Servants developed rituals around winter deaths, ways of honouring those who didn't make it while psychologically preparing themselves for the possibility of their own deaths. Some servants wrote simple wills or made informal arrangements for their possessions, understanding that winter represented a genuine mortality risk. Others developed superstitions and protective rituals designed to ward off cold-related death. These weren't just psychological comfort, they were practical acknowledgements of very real survival challenges. Regional variations in winter mortality reflected differences in climate castle construction and local survival resources. Northern European castles generally had higher winter mortality rates than those in warmer southern regions. Castles built near forests had better access to fuel and generally lower death rates than those in areas where wood was scarce. Coastal castles might have milder winters, but could face sudden storms that created deadly conditions. The record-keeping around winter deaths was often incomplete since servants weren't considered important enough to warrant detailed documentation. Many winter deaths were probably recorded simply as illness or natural causes, without specifying the role of cold exposure. This makes it difficult for modern historians to calculate exact mortality rates, but the fragmentary evidence suggests that winter death was a regular, expected part of castle life. Picture yourself in late February after one of the harshest winters in recent memory. 3 servants from your close-knit survival group didn't make it through the cold months. Old Edmund, who taught you how to bank fires properly, was found one morning at his chamber, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep when his body simply couldn't maintain core temperature any longer. Young Kate, barely 14, succumbed to a respiratory infection that her cold-weakened body couldn't fight off, and Martin, who seemed strong and healthy, was caught in a sudden blizzard while checking on animals and froze to death before he could make it back to shelter. You've survived, but survival carries its own burden. You know that next winter will bring the same risks, the same desperate calculations about heat and food and shelter. You also know that some of the new servants who arrived in spring won't see another spring themselves. Winter mortality wasn't a tragic accident. It was a predictable, recurring part of medieval life that shaped how people thought about survival, community, and their own mortality. After months of enduring medieval winter's brutal grip, nothing compared to the psychological and physical relief that arrived with the first signs of spring. For castle servants who had survived the darkest, coldest months, spring wasn't just a change of seasons, it was resurrection, renewal, and the return of hope. The spring awakening traditions that developed around these moments revealed just how psychologically devastating winter survival had been. The first signs of spring warming created almost euphoric responses among castle communities. Servants who had spent months bundled in multiple layers, sleeping in groups for warmth and constantly fighting hypothermia, could finally feel ambient temperatures that didn't threaten their lives. The simple act of waking up without visible breath clouds or walking through castle corridors without needing cloaks felt miraculous after months of survival-focused existence. Castle communities developed elaborate spring celebration rituals that served multiple psychological and social functions. These weren't just parties, they were collective acknowledgements of survival, community healing ceremonies, and preparations for the coming year. Servants who had shared body heat traded warming resources and supported each other through life-threatening conditions, needed ways to process what they had endured together and transition back to less desperate social relationships. The opening of windows and doors marked one of the most significant spring rituals. After months of keeping every possible opening sealed against drafts, the first day warm enough to allow fresh air circulation was celebrated with ceremony. Servants would systematically open shutters throughout the castle, allowing sunlight and fresh air to enter spaces that had been sealed and stagnant for months. The psychological impact of this transition from enclosed survival mode to open ventilated living was enormous. Cleaning rituals in spring were both practical and symbolic. The accumulated filth, smoke residue, and general squalor that had built up during winter survival months needed to be removed, but the cleaning process also served as psychological cleansing. Servants would scour their sleeping areas, wash clothing and bedding that had been too precious to clean during winter, and remove the physical traces of their desperate survival strategies. Personal hygiene rituals marked another crucial aspect of spring awakening. Servants who had worn the same clothes for weeks slept in unwashed conditions, and focused entirely on warmth over cleanliness, could finally bathe, change clothing, and restore some personal dignity. The first warm bath of spring was often described in almost religious terms, a purification that marked the transition from survival mode back to more normal human existence. Food rituals celebrated the return of fresh ingredients and the end of preserved food monotony. The first fresh herbs, early vegetables, and dairy products that hadn't been frozen represented not just nutritional improvement, but psychological proof that the desperate scarcity of winter was ending. Servants who had survived on stale breadroot vegetables and whatever scraps they could find could finally taste foods that reminded them of abundance rather than mere survival. The restoration of privacy was another crucial element of spring awakening. Servants who had slept in groups shared body heat with strangers and lived in constant physical proximity for survival could finally reclaim individual sleeping spaces. The luxury of sleeping alone without needing to coordinate with others for warmth represented a return to personal autonomy that many had thought they might never experience again. Work pattern changes reflected the psychological shift from survival to productivity. During winter, all activities had been filtered through the lens of staying warm and staying alive. In spring, servants could return to work routines that were about productivity, skill development, and normal social relationships rather than pure survival. The ability to focus on tasks other than heat generation felt like a form of mental liberation. Social relationship renegotiation was a complex aspect of spring transitions. Servants who had formed intense survival bonds during winter needed to figure out how those relationships would work when survival was no longer the primary concern. Some winter alliances dissolved naturally as the crisis that created them passed. Others evolved into lasting friendships based on shared survival experiences. A few became problematic as people who had shared intimate survival experiences struggled to return to normal social hierarchies. The celebration of individual survival was balanced with memorial activities for those who hadn't made it through winter. Spring awakening rituals often included remembrance ceremonies for servants who had died during the cold months, acknowledgements of the price that winter survival had extracted from the community. These memorial aspects help survivors process grief and guilt about their own survival when others had not been so fortunate. Preparation for future winters began almost immediately as spring arrived. Servants who had learned hard lessons about survival began planning for the next winter, while the memories of cold and desperation were still fresh. They would identify which survival strategies had worked, which had failed, and what resources they needed to accumulate before winter returned. Spring Awakening included a planning component that acknowledged the cyclical nature of survival challenges. Regional variations in Spring Awakening traditions reflected different winter survival experiences. Northern European castles, which faced longer and more severe winters, often had more elaborate spring celebration rituals than those in milder climates. Castles that had experienced particularly harsh winters or high mortality rates might have more somber spring observances that emphasized memorial and recovery rather than pure celebration. The timing of Spring Awakening rituals was carefully attuned to local weather patterns and survival needs. Too early and spring celebrations could be interrupted by late cold snaps that forced everyone back into survival mode. Too late, and the psychological benefits of marking the transition from winter to spring could be lost. Experienced castle communities learned to read weather signs and time their Spring Awakening activities to maximize both safety and psychological impact. Picture yourself emerging from the longest, coldest winter you've ever experienced. For the first time in months, you wake up without immediately thinking about how to stay warm. The air in your chamber doesn't hurt to breathe, you can move your fingers normally, and you don't need to check whether your toes have any feeling. The simple act of walking through castle corridors without a cloak feels like a luxury beyond anything you could have imagined during the darkest winter nights. You join other servants in opening the castle's windows for the first time since autumn, letting in air that smells of growing things rather than smoke and cold stone. You wash your hair with warm water, an impossible luxury during winter months, and put on clean clothes that haven't been worn continuously for weeks. That evening you share a meal that includes fresh herbs and vegetables, flavors that remind you that the world contains abundance as well as scarcity. The experience of surviving a medieval winter wasn't uniform across Europe. Regional differences in climate castle construction and local survival traditions created dramatically different challenges for servants depending on where they lived. Understanding these regional variations helps us appreciate the full spectrum of medieval survival strategies and reveals how local knowledge and adaptation could mean the difference between life and death. Scottish Highland castles face perhaps the most brutal conditions in medieval Europe. Built on exposed mountain tops for defensive purposes, these fortresses were battered by winds that could reach hurricane force and temperatures that could drop well below what most humans could survive without sophisticated heating. Scottish servants developed unique survival strategies that other regions never needed to consider, including techniques for dealing with ice storms that could last for weeks, and snow accumulations that could bury entire castle courtyards. The construction differences in Scottish castles reflected these extreme conditions. Many Highland fortresses included underground chambers specifically designed for winter survival, essentially bunkers where entire castle populations could retreat during the worst storms. These chambers were built into bedrock and retained ground heat that could keep temperatures survivable even when surface conditions were lethal. Scottish servants became experts at living in these underground spaces for extended periods, developing social systems and survival techniques that were unknown in milder regions. French chateau servants faced different but equally serious challenges. The damp, penetrating cold of northern French winters could be more dangerous than the dramatic but dry cold of mountain regions. French castle walls, often built from local limestone, absorbed moisture that could freeze and crack, creating constantly changing draft patterns that made heating systems unpredictable. French servants developed expertise in managing moisture and humidity skills that were less crucial in drier climates, but essential for survival in regions where damp cold could penetrate any defence. German castle servants dealt with winters that combined the worst aspects of both extreme cold and unpredictable weather patterns. The position of many German castles in river valleys meant they faced temperature inversions that could trap cold air for weeks at a time, creating deadly microclimates that were significantly colder than surrounding regions. German servants became masters of reading weather patterns and timing their survival activities to take advantage of brief warming periods that might last only hours. Italian castle servants in northern regions faced unique challenges related to rapid temperature changes. Alpine winters could shift from relatively mild conditions to life-threatening cold within hours, giving servants very little time to adapt their heating strategies. Italian servants developed rapid response survival techniques, ways to quickly convert normal living spaces into emergency heating areas when sudden cold snaps threatened their lives. The availability of fuel varied dramatically by region and shaped different survival cultures. Scottish servants often had access to peat, which burned differently than wood and required different fire management techniques. French servants might have access to charcoal, which provided concentrated heat, but required careful ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. German servants in forested regions could access hardwoods that burned long and hot, while those in deforested areas had to develop survival strategies based on inferior fuel sources. Regional food preservation techniques also affected winter survival chances. Scandinavian servants perfected fish preservation methods that provided protein sources unavailable to inland castle populations. Mediterranean servants had access to preserved olive oil and dried fruits that could provide calories and essential nutrients during food shortages. Northern European servants became experts at fermenting vegetables and grains, creating food sources that could last through extended winter periods. The social structures around survival varied by region too. Scandinavian castle communities often maintained extended family survival networks that included servants reflecting cultural traditions about community responsibility for individual survival. French castle hierarchies might be more rigid, with survival resources allocated strictly according to social rank. German castle communities sometimes developed guild-like structures among servants, with specialized survival knowledge passed down through formal apprenticeship systems. Regional differences in castle architecture created unique heating opportunities and challenges. Moorish-influenced Spanish castles included sophisticated heating systems based on hypocaust principles, where hot air was circulated through wall cavities. These systems could keep entire castle sections warm, but they required specialized knowledge to operate and maintain. Northern European castles rarely included such sophisticated heating, but they might have architectural features like spiral staircases that could trap and circulate warm air. The relationship between castle communities and surrounding populations varied regionally and affected survival resources. In some regions, castle servants could trade with nearby villages for food, fuel, or survival supplies. In other areas, castles were isolated outposts where servants had to be completely self-sufficient. These differences shaped survival strategies and determined which techniques were practical for different regional conditions. Seasonal migration patterns also varied by region. Some Scottish Highland servants would move to lower elevations during the worst winter months, essentially abandoning Highland castles temporarily when conditions became unsurvivable. Mediterranean servants might shift their living patterns within castles, moving to different sections as seasonal temperature patterns changed. These migration strategies required regional knowledge about weather patterns and alternative shelter options. Regional medical traditions affected survival techniques too. Scandinavian servants had access to herbal traditions based on Arctic plants that could help prevent cold-related illnesses. Mediterranean servants used different medicinal approaches based on herbs and techniques that worked in their climate conditions. German servants might have access to monastic medical traditions that included sophisticated understanding of nutrition and disease prevention. The psychological aspects of survival also varied regionally. Servants in regions with extremely long winters developed different mental strategies for enduring months of cold than those in areas with shorter but more intense winter periods. Cultural traditions around storytelling, music, and community activities helped servants in different regions cope with the psychological challenges of survival. But these traditions were shaped by local conditions and social structures. Picture yourself as a servant in a remote Scottish Highland castle during the worst winter storm in living memory. The wind outside is so fierce that it's physically dangerous to venture onto the castle walls, and snow has accumulated to the point where some windows are completely blocked. You and the other servants have retreated to the underground chambers that your predecessors carved from bedrock specifically for situations like this. The underground spaces are warmed by geothermal heat from the earth itself, and the thick stone walls block the sound of the wind that's been howling for 3 days straight. You're sharing this space with 30 other people, but the survival techniques your community has developed over generations make the crowded conditions manageable. Everyone knows their role in maintaining the fires, distributing food, and managing the social dynamics necessary for extended underground living. You have access to preserved foods that are specific to your region. Salted fish, fermented grains, and preserved turnips that provide nutrition unavailable to servants in other parts of Europe. The survival techniques you're using were developed specifically for highland conditions and wouldn't work in French chateau or German river castles, but they're perfectly adapted to the extreme conditions you face in this particular corner of medieval Europe. Not all castle servants were created equal when it came to winter survival. There existed a privileged tier of workers who, through skill, luck, or social connections, gained access to significantly better heating resources and survival conditions. Understanding this elite servant class reveals the complex hierarchies that determined who lived comfortably, who suffered, and who died during medieval winters. The personal servants of the Lord and his family occupied the top tier of this survival hierarchy. These weren't just any servants, they were trusted individuals who slept in chambers adjacent to their masters, tended fires in the warmest rooms, and had legitimate reasons to be near heating sources throughout the day and night. A lord's valet might sleep on a pallet at the foot of his master's bed, benefiting from the same fire that warmed the noble chamber. A lady's personal maid could spend hours in solar chambers that received both fireplace heat and whatever sunlight penetrated the thick stone walls. The head cook and senior kitchen staff formed another privileged group within the servant hierarchy. Unlike scullery maids who worked on the periphery of kitchen operations, head cooks controlled access to the main cooking fires and could legitimately remain near heat sources throughout their shifts. They also had first access to warm food and heated beverages, giving them both external and internal warming advantages. Senior kitchen staff often had their own small chambers near the kitchen areas, positioning them closer to residual heat from cooking operations. Castle chaplains and their assistants, while technically clergy rather than servants, lived within castle communities and enjoyed heating privileges that put them well above ordinary servants. Chapel areas were often heated for religious services, and chaplains frequently had private chambers that received priority fuel allocation. Their literacy and education also gave them access to medical knowledge about cold prevention and treatment that was unavailable to illiterate servants. The master-at-arms and senior guards represented another privileged servant category. These men were responsible for castle security and often had access to heated guard rooms, braziers for watch duty, and priority access to warm clothing and equipment. Their quarters were typically positioned in strategic locations that were easier to heat than remote servant chambers, and their authority within the castle hierarchy gave them access to resources that ordinary servants couldn't obtain. Skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons who worked within castle walls enjoyed significant heating advantages during their working hours. Blacksmith forges generated enormous heat that could warm entire workshop areas, and skilled craftsmen could often extend their working hours to maximize exposure to these heat sources. Their valuable skills also made them worth protecting, so castle administrators were more likely to provide them with adequate fuel and heating resources. The head groom and senior stable hands had unique access to animal heat sources that other servants couldn't reliably access. While any servant might try to befriend castle dogs or seek warmth from horses, senior stable staff had legitimate authority over animal areas and could arrange their sleeping quarters to maximize access to animal-generated heat. They also had priority access to hay and straw materials that could be used for both animal bedding and human insulation. Castle stewards and senior administrative servants enjoyed heating privileges that reflected their importance to castle operations. These individuals managed resources, coordinated activities, and maintained records that were crucial for castle function. Their chambers were often positioned in interior castle areas that stayed warmer than exterior rooms, and they had legitimate access to writing materials, candles, and small heating devices necessary for their administrative duties. Personal attendants to visiting nobles represented a temporary but significant elite within servant hierarchies. When important guests arrived at castles, their personal servants gained access to guest chambers, heated spaces, and warming resources that were normally reserved for the castle's own elite servants. These temporary privileges could make the difference between survival and serious cold-related health problems during the coldest parts of winter. The selection process for these privileged positions was complex and often arbitrary. Some servants gained elite status through demonstrated competence and reliability. Others inherited privileged positions from family members who had served in elite roles. Personal connections, regional loyalties, and even physical appearance could influence which servants gained access to the best survival conditions. The social dynamics between elite servants and ordinary castle workers were often tense. Elite servants had to balance their privileged access to heating resources with the need to maintain relationships with the broader servant community. Sharing warming resources could build valuable alliances, but hoarding those resources could ensure personal survival during the harshest conditions. These social calculations were literally matters of life and death. Some elite servants used their privileged positions to create informal heating networks that benefited larger groups of castle workers. A head cook might arrange for extra heated stones to be distributed to ordinary servants, or a master-at-arms might allow lower-ranking guards to access heated guard rooms during the coldest nights. These arrangements required careful negotiation and could be risky for the elite servants who facilitated them. The seasonal nature of elite servant privileges meant that heating advantages could change throughout winter. Servants who had access to heated spaces during early winter might lose those privileges if their duties changed, or if visiting nobles arrived with their own attendants. The constant negotiation and renegotiation of heating access created ongoing social tensions within castle servant communities. Elite servants also faced unique pressures and risks related to their privileged positions. They were expected to maintain higher standards of appearance and performance, even during harsh conditions which could require using heating resources for purposes other than pure survival. A lord's valet who appeared dirty or dishevelled could lose his position, forcing him to use precious heating resources for washing and clothing maintenance rather than warmth. The documentation of elite servant privileges is often indirect, appearing in household accounts that mention special fuel allocations in architectural records that show heated chambers designated for specific servant roles, or in personal letters that describe the living conditions of particular individuals. Direct records of heating hierarchies were rarely kept, since these arrangements were often informal and could be politically sensitive. Picture yourself as Agnes the kitchen maid, who through years of reliable service and kitchen expertise has been promoted to assistant head cook. This promotion doesn't just mean better wages and more authority, it means access to survival resources that could literally save your life. You now have a small chamber adjacent to the main kitchen that stays warm from residual heat from cooking fires. You have legitimate reasons to remain near heat sources throughout your shifts, and you have first access to warm food and heated beverages. Your new position also gives you influence over heating resource distribution within the kitchen staff. You can arrange for heated stones to be shared with servants who don't have direct access to fires, and you can time food preparation to ensure that the needier servants receive warm meals when they most need internal heat. But your privileged position also creates obligations and risks. You're expected to maintain higher performance standards even during the coldest weather, and other servants now look to you for heating resources that you may not always be able to provide. Religious communities within and around medieval castles developed fundamentally different approaches to winter survival that often proved more effective than secular strategies, despite, or perhaps because of, their emphasis on spiritual discipline over material comfort. Monasteries, convent communities, and castle chapels became laboratories for collective survival techniques that balanced religious devotion with practical heat management. Monastic communities had several structural advantages in dealing with cold that secular castle servants lacked. First, their communal lifestyle was already organized around shared resources and collective responsibility, making it easier to implement coordinated heating strategies. Monks slept in dormitories where body heat could be pooled, efficiently ate together in heated refectories, and worked together in scriptoriums and workshops that could be warmed more easily than individual chambers. The monastic daily schedule, structured around prayer times that occurred throughout the night, inadvertently created excellent fire management systems. When monks woke for matins in the middle of the night, someone was always available to tend fires, add fuel, and ensure that heating systems didn't fail during the coldest hours. This around-the-clock vigilance meant that monastic communities rarely faced the catastrophic fire failures that could kill individual servants sleeping in isolated chambers. Monastic architectural design also prioritized heating efficiency in ways that secular castle construction often ignored. Many monastery buildings included hypocaust systems, heated scriptoriums for manuscript copying, and communal spaces designed to trap and circulate warm air. The famous heated writing rooms at monasteries like Cluny and Mont Saint-Michel allowed scholarly work to continue through winter months. demonstrating that effective heating was possible with medieval technology when it was prioritized from the design phase. The economic resources available to religious communities often exceeded what individual castle servants could access. Monastic communities received donations of fuel, food, and clothing that could support sophisticated survival strategies. They also had established networks with other religious houses that could provide mutual aid during particularly harsh winters. A monastery running low on firewood might receive emergency fuel shipments from affiliated houses' support systems that were unavailable to secular servants. Religious communities also developed distinctive spiritual frameworks for understanding and enduring cold that helped with the psychological aspects of winter survival. Rather than viewing cold as pure suffering to be avoided, monastic traditions often incorporated cold endurance as spiritual discipline, making it easier for community members to accept hardship and maintain morale during difficult conditions. The preservation of knowledge within religious communities meant that effective survival techniques could be documented, refined, and passed down across generations. Monastic libraries contained treatises on fire management, food preservation, and medical care that gave religious communities access to survival knowledge that was often lost or forgotten in secular settings. Some monasteries maintained detailed records of successful winter survival strategies, creating institutional memory that improved their community's chances of surviving harsh conditions. However, religious communities also faced unique challenges that secular servants didn't encounter. Monastic rules often prohibited practices that could improve survival. Chances sharing beds for warmth might violate vows of chastity, and priority heating for the sick or elderly might conflict with principles of equality and shared suffering. Some religious communities struggled to balance spiritual commitments with practical survival needs, leading to unnecessary deaths that more flexible secular communities might have prevented. The relationship between castle chaplains and monastic communities created interesting hybrid survival strategies. Castle chapels were often heated for religious services, making them valuable warming spaces for both clergy and lay servants who attended prayers. Some castle chaplains used their positions to create informal religious communities among servants, organizing prayer groups that doubled as heating cooperatives, where spiritual observance provided legitimate reasons for gathering in heated spaces. Convent communities faced additional challenges related to gender and social expectations. Nuns were often expected to maintain higher standards of modesty and cleanliness than monks, which could limit their access to certain survival strategies. However, many convents developed sophisticated textile production capabilities that gave them access to better clothing and bedding materials than secular communities could obtain. The medical knowledge preserved in religious communities often included sophisticated understanding of cold-related illnesses and treatments. Monastic infirmaries became centers for developing and testing medical approaches to hypothermia, frostbite, and cold-related respiratory problems. Some of the most effective medieval treatments for cold-related conditions were developed and preserved within religious communities. Regional variations in religious survival strategies reflected local conditions and different monastic traditions. Cistercian communities in Northern Europe developed different cold management techniques than Benedictine houses in Mediterranean regions. Celtic monastic traditions included unique approaches to cold endurance that reflected their origins in harsh coastal environments. The interaction between religious and secular survival strategies created opportunities for knowledge transfer that benefited entire castle communities. Servants who attended religious services learned survival techniques from observing monastic practices. Castle chaplains who had trained in monastic communities brought institutional knowledge about heating and food preservation to secular castle settings. Some castle communities adopted modified versions of monastic survival practices without fully embracing religious life. Secular servants might organize prayer groups that functioned as heating cooperatives, adopt simplified versions of monastic daily schedules that improved fire management, or implement food-sharing systems based on religious models of communal responsibility. The documentation of religious survival strategies is often more complete than secular records, because monastic communities maintained better written records. Chronicles, rule books, and administrative documents from religious houses provide detailed insights into medieval survival techniques that are rarely documented in secular sources. This creates a historical bias where religious survival strategies appear more sophisticated than secular ones, though the reality was probably more complex. Picture yourself as a servant who has been granted permission to attend evening prayers in the castle chapel. The chapel is one of the few spaces in the castle that's consistently heated, since religious services require minimum comfort levels for both clergy and participants. As you kneel on the stone floor, you're absorbing heat from the chapel's braziers while participating in a spiritual practice that also functions as a survival strategy. The chaplain, who trained at a monastery before coming to the castle, has organized evening prayers to coincide with the coldest part of the day, providing servants with legitimate access to heated space when they most need it. After prayers, he leads a brief discussion of scriptural passages that relate to endurance and community support lessons that have practical applications for survival while maintaining their spiritual significance. You notice that the servants who regularly attend these religious gatherings have better survival rates than those who don't. Not just because of the direct access to heat, but because the religious community provides social support, shared resources, and institutional knowledge about survival techniques that isolated individuals rarely develop on their own. As we reach the end of our journey through the frozen corridors and desperate nights of medieval castle life, it's time to reflect on the profound legacy these survival strategies left on European civilization. The techniques that medieval servants developed to survive impossible winters didn't simply disappear when better heating technology arrived. They evolved into architectural principles, social customs, and cultural practices that shaped European society for centuries to come. The communal sleeping arrangements that medieval servants used for survival evolved into the European tradition of bed sharing that persisted well into the 18th century. The social skills that servants developed for coordinating shared body heat became the foundation for later forms of community cooperation during crises. The informal networks that servants created for sharing heating resources provided models for mutual aid societies, guild systems, and cooperative arrangements that would define European economic relationships for generations. Medieval heating architecture improved dramatically over time, directly influenced by the survival techniques that castle inhabitants developed through trial and error. The small, easily heated chambers that proved most effective for servant survival became the model for later castle and manor house design. The tapestry systems that servants used to create thermal barriers evolved into more sophisticated wall treatments and insulation techniques. Even the modern European preference for smaller, more intimate living spaces can be traced back to medieval discoveries about the relationship between room size and heating efficiency. The social hierarchies that developed around heating resources established patterns of privilege and cooperation that influenced European class structures for centuries. The informal economies that servants created for trading heating resources provided models for later market systems and labour organisation. The leadership roles that emerged around survival coordination influenced ideas about merit-based authority that would eventually challenge traditional aristocratic privilege. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological resilience that medieval servants developed in the face of extreme survival challenges created cultural attitudes about endurance, community support, and collective responsibility that became fundamental to European identity. The experience of surviving winter through cooperation rather than individual wealth challenged social assumptions about the relationship between privilege and survival capability. The medical knowledge that developed around cold survival contributed to European understanding of hypothermia, nutrition, and public health. The food preservation techniques that were perfected under survival conditions improved European diet and food security. The architectural innovations driven by heating needs influenced building design across the continent. The social innovations created by survival necessity provided models for later institutional development. Modern archaeological investigation of medieval castles reveals physical evidence of the survival strategies we've explored. Modifications to servant quarters, evidence of unauthorized heating installations where patterns that suggest communal sleeping arrangements and architectural adaptations that improved heating efficiency all provide material confirmation of the desperate ingenuity that medieval people brought to the challenge of winter survival. The contrast between medieval and modern heating challenges helps us appreciate both how far we've come and what we might still learn from medieval survival strategies. Modern people facing power outages, natural disasters, or economic crises that interrupt heating systems often rediscover techniques that medieval servants developed centuries ago. The community cooperation strategies, resource-sharing systems, and practical heating techniques that enabled medieval survival remain relevant for contemporary emergency preparedness. Climate historians studying the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age use evidence from castle survival strategies to understand how ordinary people adapted to changing weather patterns. The survival techniques that servants developed provide insights into climate adaptation that remain relevant as contemporary societies face new environmental challenges. The democratic implications of medieval survival strategies are profound. When survival depended on cooperation rather than individual wealth, social hierarchies became less important than practical contribution to community welfare. Servants who could maintain fires, share heating resources, or coordinate survival activities gained respect and influence that challenged traditional status boundaries. These experiences contributed to evolving European ideas about merit authority and social responsibility. The European cultural emphasis on community solidarity, mutual aid, and collective responsibility that distinguishes European societies from more individualistic cultures can be traced partly to medieval survival experiences where individual survival was impossible without community cooperation. The modern European welfare state, with its emphasis on collective security and shared responsibility for individual welfare, reflects values that were literally forged in the frozen corridors of medieval castles. As you pull your warm blankets closer tonight and listen to the gentle hum of your heating system, remember that you are the beneficiary of centuries of accumulated knowledge about human survival. The comfortable temperature in your bedroom, the efficient heating system that maintains it, and even the social institutions that ensure your access to fuel and shelter all evolved from the desperate ingenuity of people who faced winter nights that could kill them. The medieval servants who huddled together for warmth, who befriended castle dogs for their body heat, who developed elaborate systems for sharing heating resources, and who created communities that could survive conditions that would challenge modern people. These forgotten individuals contributed as much to human civilization as any king or knight. Their legacy lives in our architecture, our social institutions, our understanding of community responsibility, and our capacity for cooperation in the face of impossible challenges. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in warmth and comfort, that medieval castle servants could never have imagined you carry with you the inheritance of their resilience, their ingenuity, and their profound understanding that survival, true survival, is never a solitary achievement. It is always ultimately a community accomplishment forged in the recognition that human beings are at their best when they share what little they have to ensure that everyone makes it through the darkness together. And now, as our long winter's journey through medieval castle survival comes to a close, let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the warmth surrounding you, the security of your shelter, the promise of tomorrow's dawn. In the chambers of your imagination, the castle grows quiet. The servants find their rest, and even the stones themselves seem to exhale, releasing the day's tensions into the peaceful darkness. The wind that once howled through ancient battlements now whispers gently, carrying stories of resilience and community, of small acts of kindness that kept hope alive through the longest nights. The fires that once meant the difference between life and death now glow softly in your memory, reminders that human ingenuity and cooperation can overcome even the most impossible challenges. Sleep now, wrapped in the knowledge that you are part of an unbroken chain of human survival that stretches back through centuries. Rest in the comfort that was earned through the determination of countless forgotten individuals who refused to surrender to the cold, who shared their warmth, and who discovered that together even the darkest winter eventually gives way to spring. Sweet dreams, and may you always find warmth in the bonds of community, just as our ancestors did so long ago.